Hey everybody, it's Rod with Van Guns, coming back at you with another video. Today I want to go over scopes, rifle scopes, primarily scopes you might use on a rifle for hunting. Now today though I want to talk about something I don't hear talked about too much, and that's more of the optical design of these scopes and why you might choose, say, a scope with a 40 millimeter objective or a 50 or a 56 or a 24 or a 32. About why these scopes are made the way they are, why some scopes are real expensive, $2,000, $3,000 in some cases, why some cheaper scopes sometimes can deliver real good results despite being a fraction of the cost of the more expensive scopes. And there are some things to look for to try and tailor the best scope for your budget. And so I'm going to focus kind of on the design of these things and when an inexpensive scope can do the job and when an inexpensive scope might not. So this is my Tikka Superlight. You can see I've got a Vortex Crossfire 2 scope mounted on this. I mentioned this scope a little bit in the video I did about this Tikka Superlight. This is an inexpensive scope. It's not a cheap scope, but it's inexpensive. I got this for $170 last summer. It's surprisingly good, and I mentioned that in the video. Why I'm showing it to you today is because this is a perfect example of what I call the bread and butter rifle scope. This is a 40 millimeter scope with a 3x to 9x magnification range, a simple 3-to-1 ratio on the magnification range, down to 3, up to 9. Very easy for engineers to design this type of scope and make it good, even at a bargain price that I got this one for. Now, why is that? Well, first of all, let's talk about the front objective. Here, this is usually measured in millimeters, and typically you'll find 40 is very common. 50 is kind of a larger objective. I've seen them 56 millimeter. And this keeps getting fatter and fatter when you do that. And you can find some scopes that are 24 millimeter objectives or 32. The common ones that I see routinely on scope manufacturers' websites are 24, 32, 40, and 50, and even 56. And there are others, of course, but those seem to be really common. What you'll find is that just about every single scope maker under the sun has got a 3 to 9x with a 40 millimeter objective. Now, why is that? It's kind of the sweet spot for engineers that design optical scopes. And that's why you'll see lots of them spread around across a wide variety of price ranges. It's fairly easy for these guys to design that type of scope and make it pretty good. Even this inexpensive Vortex is pretty darn good. So I'm not an optical engineer, so I'm going to keep this simple and basic. Basically, you've got a number of things that a scope is trying to do for you. One of the things is allowing a lot of light in so that you can get a clear, crisp image even in low light. That's where that front objective diameter plays a major role, because that's the light gathering part of the lens. The next thing the scope is typically trying to do is magnify your image. Not always, there are some 1x scopes, but generally we're looking at 2 to 10, 3 to 9, 6 to 18, all these different various ranges, and it's trying to magnify the image, bring that image up close to you so that you can see details that are at a great distance away. And then you've got just the basic size of the scope. How much room does the optical engineer have to work with? So as far as the optical tube diameter, you'll typically find 1 inch, which is 25.2 millimeters, and 30 millimeter. The 30 millimeter tube has the advantage of giving the engineers a little more room to work with to improve light transmission. Now, I'm going to start with light transmission. So modern scopes are going to use optical coating, multi-coatings. If it says fully multi-coated, then generally that means every air-to-glass surface inside that scope is multi-coated. There's a number of lens elements that are used to make these variable zoom scopes. If it just says multi-coated, which you might find on a cheaper scope, then it might only have the 2 exterior surfaces multi-coated, and you're going to have a lot of light loss and optical reflections and flare. So that would not be recommended. But basically, most modern optics are multi-coated all throughout every air-to-glass surface inside. Anything over $100 is probably going to be fully multi-coated. But that is important. Then you've got the zoom range. 3-to-1 zoom ranges are pretty easy for optical engineers to design. And so when you start asking for more, I want the scope to go from 3 to 24. Now the engineer's got a lot more work to do. There's going to be a lot more glass elements in there, a lot more moving parts, and a lot more opportunity for there to be optical aberrations. And this can be anything from coma on the edges or a softening on the edges of the view. It can also lead to just not being super sharp and crisp, or it can lead to the need to use rare earth glass elements, things like extra low dispersion glass and lanthanum glass and all these things. They get real expensive. So this is why you'll see some scopes get real expensive, $1,000, $1,500, $2,000. And that's because oftentimes those scopes are using these kinds of glasses and these types of super complex designs. Basic scope designs like a 3x to 9x 40mm scope, generally speaking, those are low-hanging fruit for engineers. Engineers aren't going to have a big problem making a good quality design that's going to deliver really, really good results for you without having to put all that rare earth glass in there. Now, some scope manufacturers will put the high-end glass even in the more simple designs. Will you see a difference? Absolutely. Is it going to be major? Probably not. But when you start asking that scope to have a 50mm diameter objective or a 56mm diameter objective, and you want that thing to have an extended zoom range of, say, 6 to 24 or 2 to 18, these types of long extended ranges with a lot of light gathering ability, yeah, a cheap scope trying to do that is not going to look pretty. It's just not going to look good. Okay, objective diameter. This is that 40mm, 50mm, 32mm. The primary function of the main objective is light gathering. This is what's bringing in the light. The larger that objective, the more light it can bring in. So you might think, oh, I've got a 24mm objective. If I go to a 50, that's a little more than double the light gathering. But in reality, it's not. To double your light gathering ability from a 24mm objective, you would need a 35mm objective. If you went to a 48mm objective, you'd actually be quadrupling the light gathering ability of that lens element. So that's based all on sort of the area of a circle. So as far as light gathering is concerned, there's a couple of other things that matter as far as the amount of light available to your eye. So the first thing is the zoom range. The longer the zoom range, the more magnification that you have, the less light ultimately will be transmitted to your eye. And that's going to be determined by something called the exit pupil. So the exit pupil is the size of the shaft of light that comes out of the back of your scope and goes into your eye. Your eye has what's called an entrance pupil. That's the diameter of the opening in your eye, the part of your eye that's black and opens and closes depending on how bright it is outside or how dark it is. The typical range for the average human eye is about 2 millimeters of opening to about 8 millimeters of opening. 8 millimeters is limited more for younger people. As you age, your eye cannot open up as wide. By the time you're an older person in your 70s, you may only be able to open your eye to about 6 millimeter. But if you have a shaft of light coming out of the back of your scope larger than the maximum diameter your eye is able to open, it's kind of wasted light. Likewise, if you're in bright daylight, your eye's going to be closed down to 2 millimeter or 3 millimeter, so you don't really need a large exit pupil out of your scope. So determining that light gathering, why is it important? Well, it's important for two reasons. One, if you want big magnification, 18x, 20x, 24x, then you need a little more light gathering so that you get a nice crisp image even in broad daylight.
If you're looking for low light performance, then you're looking at that larger objective to give you more magnification and still deliver that 7 or 8 millimeter exit pupil to your eye. I've got a chart to kind of show you how that looks. So the chart here shows you the various magnifications that can be achieved with a specific exit pupil. So I've got healthy young eyes at 8 millimeter, kind of healthy middle-aged eyes at 7 millimeter, and then older person eyes at 6 millimeter. And then I've got your daylight 2 millimeter. In bright daylight, your eye is going to be closed down near the minimum and 2 millimeter is kind of the standard for the minimum. And the reason I do that is it allows you to see the maximum magnification in bright daylight. So a 56 millimeter objective, you can get 28x and you're still getting the maximum amount of light that your eye can receive. Whereas with a 24 millimeter objective lens, you're down to 12x. So that could be important to you for if you're a long range shooter. You're often shooting in daylight, but your target's far away and the 28x might come in handy, or 25 or even 20x. Now, you'll notice also the maximum magnification for a healthy young person with an 8 millimeter exit pupil or entrance pupil in the eye, 56 is giving you 7x, whereas 24 is only giving you 3x. And so you're going to get a lot more magnification without giving up that low light performance. So I hope this chart kind of helps as far as understanding why you might get a scope with a large objective diameter and why you might not need that. Just depends on your specific use. One other note regarding exit pupil that might be helpful, particularly for hunters in extreme low light, low contrast scenes. If you're using, let's say you're using a 3 to 9x 40 millimeter scope, real common scope, like that Vortex scope, and you're out and it's just real dim and you're trying to make out details. If you're maxed out at 9x, try dialing that down to, if you're a young person, to 5x, if you're a middle-aged person like me, to 6x, and 7x if you're an older person. Just dial the power back a little and you might notice the image gets a little brighter, and that little extra bit of brightness and contrast could be the difference between spotting an animal and not spotting an animal. So in closing, if you're looking for a budget type scope, keep the zoom range short, 3:1 or less. Don't try to have the scope do too much. As you move up and you want more and more features and so on, expect to pay more money, obviously. And a lot of scopes, a lot of the money is tied up in things like weather sealing, overall build quality. You know, your high-end Leupolds and Carl Zeiss and Leicas are really built well, and there's something to be said for that. And then there's also fancy turrets that have, you know, in-field adjustments and reticles, illuminated reticles, and you've got first plane and second plane. All of that stuff is important. And when you're looking at rifle scopes, take that into consideration. Today I was just trying to kind of look at it from an optical perspective and not those other things that also are very important as well.
I hope that was helpful, and that's all I got today. We'll see you in the next video.